Welcome to Paragraphs and Single Directory Components, a dynamic duo, where we'll discuss how these two modules can work together and improve developer and site editor experiences on Drupal from the lens of a project we implemented the structure in. My name is Michelle Smolensky. I am a lead developer at Chromatic, and I also have with me our senior developer, co-presenter, and coworker, Mart Matsu. So to start off, I wanted to discuss a bit about the project that we implemented this on, just because this didn't arise in a vacuum. Our choice to use paragraphs and SDC together, and the project that we implemented this within also wasn't a greenfield project, and there's a good chance that potentially if you choose to use this, it also might not be a greenfield project. So for just a little bit of history, originally we had a client with several siloed off sites, and this obviously came with a lot of duplication of code across these sites, as well as a large maintenance cost for them. So our initial improvement about 7 years ago came in the form of bundling these sites into a multi-site that delivered independent production sites. And obviously there's pros to that approach. It reduced the maintenance cost of keeping Drupal updates and module updates for them. And then it also began to allow us to have reusable components via paragraphs for them. And it also allowed their product itself to become more scalable since they didn't have to rely on these individual sites anymore. And also allowed shared config for all these child sites. And with that, there were still cons to this approach that we started to see. While there was scalability up to like about 25, 26 sites, we nonetheless saw that there was a potential breakdown in the scalability once we were considering 50, 100 sites. So while we had reduced the maintenance costs as it related to Drupal itself, we had accrued technical debt over time in the themes themselves via template overrides, custom JS, and just the SaaS maintenance across all these sites. As well, that kind of like leads into point 3, where while we had really great documentation, particularly around the back end, we were kind of lacking a unifying ethos to how each child site should approach applying the styles, because an important note is that even though this is a single client, each site has very unique branding. So we ran into issues where some sites were extending the parent styles from the parent theme, but oftentimes they were just completely overriding them, as well as the issue with the template overrides is that as paragraphs themselves were being improved, sites that had the template overrides might not have access to the new fields. So that also led to difficulties in managing which paragraphs had styles for which sites, as well as which paragraph variants were available per each site. So it was hard for site editors to quite know what they could use on each site, as well as for the designers. And this also was due to the lack of being able to easily preview the components. So to try and address these issues, we pitched implementing SDC along with the established paragraphs, as well as switching from SAS to modern CSS and creating a component library with them using all three. And also, just to give a little bit more context, so in total, from the time we did the discovery to the end of phase 1 was about 10 to 14 months of time we put into this. It's important to note that I don't mean 10 to 14 months in pure like developer 100% on the project, because this was like a client, like I said, had about 25, 26 sites. And so each of those sites had needs over the course of the project itself. So there was like some weeks it was 100% working on this like SDC paragraph transition. And then there were also some weeks where it was 0% of our time towards this. So to I'll try to go through this relatively quickly so we can get to the technical details. And if there's like questions, I can answer them at the end or talk with you afterwards. But the discovery phase, we met with the client in person with site owners, a team of their designers, and other stakeholders to talk about some issues that have been coming up over time for them and work together to improve the existing components and discuss new ones that would help support their work better overall. And then as we were working, the design, updating paragraphs, consolidating templates, and the SAS transition were all and the component library were all happening kind of concurrently to kind of keep things moving along. The biggest thing I'll just mention here, and like I said, I can go into this in detail later, but as you can see, the SAS to CSS transition ended up being our largest effort, which I think from what I said earlier about the differences between the styles across sites, also the way they were handled. We had the template overrides, which meant we had a lot of one-off selectors to account for and update to kind of create this more powerful parent. And then because there were child sites that had completely ignored styles from the parent theme, once we kind of reconnected those, there was a need to kind of negate styles that were now causing regressions, as well as I'm pretty sure many front-end developers kind of know, over time as selectors stop being used or old mix-ins and functions, a lot of times those aren't removed. So it was also a lot of cleaning out some old code. Connected with that, obviously, QA took a lot of time. We had these 26 sites. We wanted to make sure that there were no regressions being introduced because ideally this was a big change in how we approach the project from a code standpoint, but from their standpoint, their existing sites were not supposed to have any regressions. So required a lot of testing to make sure that happened, which also I don't think would have been possible without Diffie to help us with the visual regression testing. And with that, I will pass it to Mart to discuss some of the technical details.
Thank you very much. So we're just going to go through briefly the paragraph module. Can we have a show of hands? Has everyone used the paragraph module? It's been around for a long, long time. Over 200,000 sites apparently use it. And could I just have a show of hands when I ask that, have you built and configured, added fields to, worked with the paragraph entity more as a site builder back-end developer versus perhaps as using the paragraphs on the front end as a site editor? Are there any that only use it as a site editor, perhaps? Okay, great, great. Okay, so these bits will be very familiar to you then. This will look familiar. A paragraph is just an entity, much like a node is an entity or a taxonomy term. And when you see a screen like this, it's a portion of the managing of the fields, so you can add fields. And this is for a hero component that we're going to show and come back to a little bit later. So I'm just showing some visuals to kind of maybe familiarize what I'm talking about. So on the front end, here's an example of a sample homepage we have with a hero. And that is our hero paragraph, and this is before we've connected anything with SDC. And if we go back and connect the fields to what you see in the hero, your new mental health benefit is a title, makes sense, then there's a background image. And of course the paragraph allows site editors to add their data, their content in a structured way. So imagine having to WYSIWYG that. You'd have to have a site editor that is an HTML expert. Of course we don't do that anymore, but if we go further, we see that absolutely every element on this homepage is a paragraph. And that's it about paragraphs, because you guys know all about them. So single directory components, I would ask the same question. They're newer in Drupal. They only became part of core in Drupal 10.3, so that's fairly recent. Can we have a show of hands with people who are already using single directory components? Okay, a lot less, so this is where we'll talk about what single directory components are. You've probably heard them mentioned in other presentations. I've heard a lot of SDC and talk about props and slots, so we're just going to explore that a little bit here so that we're all on the same page. So let's continue. What is an SDC? As I just mentioned, single directory component. So what does that mean? It means that you have everything you need to build and render that component in one directory, which is nice because instead of having to go find a style somewhere else, you know where it is. So what I'm showing here is a welcome component, which I created as a tool while I was developing this contrib module that we're just going to briefly mention later. It's not pretty, but all it does is it uses different props and slot types. And so I'm going to be mentioning it, and you're going to see this ugly thing, and I'm just introducing it to you. So when we talk about single directory components, Drupal looks for them by looking into enabled themes and modules, and you'll have a subdirectory called components, and that Drupal will look inside of there and look for any components it can find. So in this case, there are two subdirectories, heading and, again, welcome. And when I open up the welcome directory, we see 4 files. So 2 of these are required, the welcome.component.yaml file and also the welcome.twig. So the welcome.component.yaml file defines the structure of the component, and so that's telling us what it's going to actually hold. And if you don't have a twig file, there's nothing to render, because that's where the markup is going to be rendered. Now the other 2 files, the CSS and the JS, those are optional, but anyone who's worked with CSS and JS will know what they do, and it's kind of self-explanatory here. They'll be used with this component. Okay, so this is going to be hard to read. We've tried to make it as big as possible, but this is what a component.yaml file looks like. So this is the welcome component.yaml file. Just at the top, you'll have some metadata about it. The first line is schema, and that link, if you were to follow it, you'd get a big page with JSON, and that describes the structure of what's allowed to be in this component.yaml file, which keys are allowed. The rest, the name, the group description, just tells you where it is, so to speak, what it is, and the status on line 5. It's said stable here. The other options are, I believe, obsolete, deprecated, and experimental. So now we go into what's the crux of the matter, the props and the slots, and this is how we define the component. So for the welcome component, if we look down, there's the props key, and below it, it has its own properties key. And when we go through, what I want to point out here, so when you have your props, like here you hopefully can read, maybe it says blurb, and then the one I'm highlighting here is welcome enum example. I'm pointing out enum just to come back to the component YAML file structure. So this is an enumerated list of what's allowed in that field. And so that means also you can just like validation at the component level. You can say this field can only accept, in this case it's blue, black, or white, a string. And if you try to pass data to that component that's not blue, black, or white to that field, the component will blow up and you'll probably get a white screen of death. So enum is one example, but also for different field types, you can also specify, for instance, for an integer, what the minimum allowed value is, what the maximum is, for string length, the min length and max length. So you could get pretty granular in controlling what that component is allowed to display right in the component.yaml, not having to do it, say, once we go to the paragraph at the paragraph field level. So I just wanted to point that out. And here's some different types of props that you can use. So the types are string, integer, number for decimal values, and you can get down into array and object as well. There's also a Boolean and a null. And I wanted to point out the default key for each prop. When you look at components, I'm not trying to say awful, I'm trying to say you'll often not see a default key, but I would encourage you to use one, because if you try to display a component in a preview somewhere and there's no default value to use, there's nothing for it to display. So props use the default key, and if you can read like the integer 3, and then I've got pi in there for the number example. And slots, which we'll get to soon, a little bit confusingly, they don't use the default key, they use the key examples. But we'll get there soon.
For the new features, that's going to become like the best practice also, because Experience Builder, if you don't use that for the JavaScript components, they also bring.
So I believe you just said that the new default will be examples for everything? Awesome. That's exactly the kind of thing I wanted to hear and hadn't read anywhere yet. But I don't pay too much attention, I guess. Great, thank you very much. All right, so I'm just pointing out this blurb field. There's nothing special about it, but now I'm just going to show how the twig and the component interact. So in the default, it says, have fun playing with the SDC library. And here we look at the twig file for the welcome component, and we just bring out the blurb. It's a twig variable like you've probably seen before if you've worked with twig templates. And then this is this part of my welcome component rendered on the front end, what the user sees. And so this is simply the connection. The twig file on the left showing the blurb variable passed into the rendered component, and then that shows, hey, we have a prop called blurb, and that's how they're all interconnected inside of the single directory component. And just quickly pointing out the array type, you can loop through them in the twigs. I just wanted to bring that out, so you would have a for loop in twig and loop through that field, and then you can spit out the values on the front end, so it's just saying hello in a few different languages. And now we get to slots. There isn't that much to say about slots, simply because whereas props have different types, slots are just slots, and what the slot is meant for is to hold unstructured data. So think about rendered markup. It'll basically hold anything you want to put into it, like a bucket that's happy to take whatever you can pour into it. So if we look back at the twig template in the footer, you'll see a twig block structure. And in there, I'm just pointing out that there's already markup, and it says this footer markup lives in welcome.twig. For those unfamiliar with it, this doesn't render on the front end if that welcome footer variable is populated. When I began looking at twig templates and I would see this, in my mind I was like, okay, there's markup in there. That's what I should be seeing on the front end. But on the front end, whatever's passed into that variable is what gets rendered. So this was the default, the example for that slot field where it says copyright this year. Okay, and we'll just quickly go through the optional files. So we have the welcome.css and the welcome.js. So I remind you again that the text for my welcome component is black. If I were to edit the CSS file and change it from black to red, sure enough, it turns red. And the same goes for JavaScript. If I add a JavaScript file with an alert saying hello Atlanta, it will then render. Now, there's nothing magical about that, except you don't have to mess with adding any libraries into a libraries.yaml file if you're familiar with theming. And you don't have to use something like attach library on the twig template to tell it, hey, use these files. So it just automatically gets loaded into the component, which is nice because that just means the front ender can go to that directory and work with the component and doesn't have to look in a bunch of different places and doesn't have to wonder why the CSS isn't loading or the JavaScript's not loading. Oh yeah, I have to add something to the libraries. None of that. It gets done automatically. And so now we get to the main event. How do we get paragraphs and single directory components working together? Okay. So when we talk about the why, I'll just remind you, paragraphs are a structured way for a site editor to add content, very much like components, and SDCs are components, so combining them makes a lot of sense. Now the how, this is really the technical part. We're going to show you the hero component that we have. This is the one that's pretty much out in the wild, one that we use. And so you can pass in the props and the slots. Now the props are usually going to be simpler values. Think about like class names or maybe heading levels that you're passing, things that your users probably won't see. They'd probably be like an HTML attribute or something like that. And it's the slots on the front end that the users will probably see. So this is our component file for our hero. I've blown it up here a little bit so you can see on the left, when we're talking about props, there's only two of them, title, treatment, and variant. And on the right, to build that hero that you saw before, these are all the slots, and these are corresponding to the fields that we're going to look at for the paragraph. So just to give an idea, this is the twig file for the hero component. We blew it up a bit so you can see better, but at the bottom, it is mostly twig blocks. There's a little bit of hard-coded markup, but mostly we're passing the variables through twig blocks into the slots that get used. And to bring out the CSS in terms of effort, this is a portion of the CSS file that handles that hero. It's actually over 500 lines, so it was pretty involved. Thank you, Michelle, for building that. And then this is the most important slide for my part of the presentation, because this is where we get data from the paragraph into the component. So we'll just spend a minute here. The second line, as reads line 20, we're using a twig embed structure, and it says embed benzi : hero. Now, benzi is the name of our parent theme. That's where the component that we want lives, and hero is the name of the component. So basically, this is where we say use the component. And if you look at the name of the file, paragraph -- hero.html.twig, it's a typical paragraph twig template. So if you've worked with node templates, paragraph templates, this is what Drupal looks for when it has an entity. It says, you know, okay, I've got a paragraph entity. I know there's a paragraph twig template that knows how to render it. And then you can focus that onto whichever type of paragraph. So in this case, we have a paragraph called hero. So we're matching them up as well. Our component's called hero. It doesn't need to be. It could be called whatever. But it makes sense to have the same machine name. So Drupal, knowing it has a hero paragraph to render, is going to look for a paragraph twig template. And this is the paragraph twig template we have. And we say, no. Use this component, the hero component. And here we're passing all of the variables, all the data that Drupal has to give over to our component to take over the rendering. And another thing I want to point out, when we look at the blocks, for instance, line 31, if you can see, CTA link, really any of them, we're not passing raw values, we're passing content.field_CTA. So that is giving us Drupal's rendered, formatted output. So what we did earlier, we would sometimes pass like raw values, thinking we just need to get this raw value over to a template. And that could cause problems down the road. You want to trust Drupal a bit and say, hey, Drupal, we know that you have ways to format fields and do all sorts of stuff automatically. So we're going to take everything you have automatically and pass it into our template, and then we're going to style it the way it needs to be styled, instead of trying to get only down to like a raw text string or value. We're going to let Drupal also have its say. So that's why we're using content.field_CTA and all these examples here. And now I'm going to pass it to Michelle.
Yes, so our talk is talking about the dynamic duo of SDC and paragraphs, but as we were working on this during the discovery phase, we realized we could also get a lot out of this multi-site structure and the way we kind of handle things by also including CSS variables in a pretty powerful way. You might have noticed in the previous slide, the hero.css file might have looked a little bit weird. It was well, I'll show it to you in a second as well. But so the similar vein that we have of taking data from paragraphs and from those child sites and passing it to the single directory component that lives in the parent theme, we kind of went with the same plan with the CSS variables, where, as you can see here, this is within Benzi components hero directory in the hero.css. As you'll see, we have this class, and then we have some scoped CSS variables, which you'll notice have just pretty much not really doing anything values. And then those values are called within the properties. And that allows us to then, in the child themes, update those CSS variables with the actual values we want, and that gets passed down to the parent SDC CSS. And so this is kind of what we decided to go with to kind of improve the front end side of the work. Now, instead of like a front end developer per each of these sites, finding it, having an easier time just kind of adding properties in the child themes and kind of creating that bloat that I sort of talked about earlier. Now, for these very common components that are pre-existing in the platform, they just have to update the property values and change the styles. And it's pretty powerful. Like, these are 2 different child themes passing different types of properties, not even necessarily having a value for each of the properties that are defined here, but still being able to create very different looks across all of the sites. To also kind of facilitate that, as Mart explained, SDC kind of bundles the CSS that it finds within the SDC component directories. And so to kind of connect the child themes, or the child sites CSS, we are using libraries extends in the child themes to sort of connect the what you see here to be able to be passed over there. It would probably also be possible to just compile literally all the CSS variables, but that would be excessive. So we're kind of keeping them grouped together with the component that they're connected to. And off of that, some people might wonder why Sunset SAS. It's been used for a long time. Obviously, as I mentioned, this project has been around for a while, so the SAS has been rather long-lived. But as we were doing this work, cleaning up a lot of stuff, frankly, modern CSS has improved a lot. A lot of the uses that SAS was developed for to make front-end development easier, it's a little bit less obvious to use it nowadays. Like you saw, we have CSS variables natively in CSS now, as well as mixins and functions are coming down the pipeline. And so this also gave us the ability to further reduce the maintenance costs for our client. Now we no longer have to worry about a number of packages that were just part of the front end dev experience, and we no longer have to worry about the SAS compilers or watchers while we work. And as I sort of mentioned, and Mart also mentioned, the style sheets can be quite large because of the number of CSS variables that might be passed, as well as within the parent theme, the hero.css file has a lot of CSS variables that are kind of created to potentially accommodate all the child sites. But this kind of allows the guardrails I was talking about for front-end developers. They're no longer reinventing the wheel per each site, kind of applying all new styles, sometimes duplicating styles. If, like I said before, they were just completely ignoring the parent style sheet. This kind of also helps keep costs down because we're not doing that any longer. It'll help speed up development for new sites that get brought onto the platform, and also frees up some of that budget to kind of improve styles overall, potentially adding in more animations or freeing up budget for other initiatives they want to do rather than just building the front-end design of the site. And with that, I'll pass it back to Mart.
So we have all these components now, and we need a way to look at them. Michelle mentioned near the beginning that it was difficult to know about all the paragraphs we had even, and never mind how to preview them, because we had around 20 sites or so, and if you wanted to actually see what it looks like on site A, you would have to add that paragraph somewhere on site A, and it may not even be used on site A at the time. So really you're becoming a site editor just to be able to start developing and working on that component as a front-end developer. So we decided that for this project, we needed to have a component library, and they exist. There are contrib modules, but we developed our own because we wanted to specify exactly what we needed for our use case, meaning that here's that welcome component again. This is the SDC library that we built in the beginning. On the left are all the site components, and you can click on them, and then it'll load the defaults and show you what it looks like. But keep in mind, we're talking about site single directory components and paragraphs. And so as soon as we built this initial phase where it can show you a component on its own, we realized, no, we want to see what it looks like when it's combined with its paragraph. So it has a submodule called SDC Library Paragraphs. And so now when we look at this hero that you've seen before, the module will look through the site that you're on and say, they want to see a hero paragraph. I'm going to see if there's any hero paragraphs already somewhere in the site. And it'll find one, choose one arbitrarily, and display it. And then it uses the actual paragraph edit form. And this is, imagine we've scrolled down in a second. I'm just pointing out the title that we're going to change in a minute. And so this is the actual paragraph edit form for the hero paragraph. And so it's pre-filled with the values for this paragraph. And say we want to see what it's going to look like with a super long title. We can just put a long title in there and then click the update component button, and then it pushes things, and then our front end developers can play with it and make adjustments as necessary. And what we also have is the ability to change themes and see what that looks like with a different theme. So this is what that same component looks like with our parent Benzie theme. And we can go through all the site themes that we have, the different sites, and see them. So it's one place where we can play with our paragraphs and see how they look. And you might wonder, why not Storybook? And the whole reason was we didn't want to add another application into the stack of tools we were using and whatever dependencies that application might have on its own. And also, we were concerned that it wouldn't be easy to contribute anything back to it in terms of if we needed a new feature during our work with our client and for whatever reason the Storybook connection wasn't good. So that's why we built our own contrib module, and that is available, but we're going to mention that in a sec. Not that. And now Michelle's going to give us the takeaways.
Yeah. So this is just like a summary of what we talked about. So the project results overall, technical improvements, paragraphs, and SDC were great together. They really make sense, and they provide kind of that, now with SDC, it provides that connection from the developer point of view that it already was existing for site editors via paragraphs. Overall, with our client, we were able to develop 36 new foundational components. We reduced the child theme templates that were existing across all these different child sites by 57% and counting, as well as transitioned over a third of styles to pure CSS. The project itself is still ongoing till we get to 100%, but like I mentioned, there's a lot of sites, a lot of CSS, a lot to get through. And also, this is partially the benefit of just SDC itself and the way it kind of bundles the style sheets with the components, that now we also are reducing the amount of CSS that we load per page, because since the components bundle their own style sheets, we're kind of following that all together. So instead of one big compiled CSS file, we now have these smaller batches. And this also resulted in improved workflows. Before working on this project, each of the teams were semi-siloed off, obviously, like us as our own agency, and then even within the client side, they had the site owners and they had the designers, and there was some connection, but it wasn't very complete. I would say, to illustrate the disconnect in one way, each team, prior to us meeting together, would refer to the same component in different ways depending on the team. So some teams called the block quote component the block quote. The site owners might refer to it as a CTA, which could get very confusing because we also had a different component called a CTA. So, in being able to meet with them and work on this project, we were able to kind of align on proper names for all the components. As well as this improves new site onboarding rather than, as I mentioned before, reinventing the wheel each time with like template overrides that were ultimately unnecessary, or completely ignoring CSS, the parent theme CSS. We now kind of have a really set way to bring on new sites and a very quick way now to style the pre-existing components. And like I said, open up space for creating new components if necessary, experimenting with like the design itself, and now improving other aspects of the site and not just working on translating another hero into a new site for them. And then this also obviously improved documentation for what components are available for each site through the component library. And then there's also the component library.
Yeah, and I would just mention that there is a little bit of fiddling if you want to give it a try. We have to be able to tell the component that it links up with a specific paragraph, so we've added our own key that you would add to a component. So basically, if you can edit a file and add a line, then you can try enabling the SDC library paragraphs module, the submodule as part of it, and hopefully without too much difficulty, you should be able to link up your components to paragraphs and preview them in this way, which should be handy. And what's really nice is, because it takes a fair bit of work, is that our people have actually used it. So that's always nice when someone uses the work that you've built. And so just at the bottom, that's an example. It's SDC_library, in case you want to give it a shot. And I believe that's it. So Michelle will field all your questions.
Yes.
You spent a lot of time about like reducing complexity with this stuff, but I want to ask a question about adding complexity back in. So for people who are working on components and they have logic that they want to put in there, do you happen to know at the SDC level if there's any method for adding in custom PHP functions or Twig filters or anything like that that's like kind of scoped to the component?
I mean, in terms of using Twig functions, and feel free to jump in if you want. I mean, all the Twig functions that are available would also be available in the .twig file. In terms of the PHP functions, I mean, we have a few pre-processed functions for some of like the variables, and you might have noticed that in one of the hero.twig file, and we just kind of pass the, where is it? Yeah, we just pass like the variable itself through the paragraph hero. We have that hero title. That's like a pre-processed function that we have for some specific needs of the client, as well as the hero style and title treatment. I don't know if that answers the question.
I'm not sure, but like you're thinking about like a very component-specific functionality as opposed to what Twig gives us out of most of the box? Yeah, I can't say. I can't.
Because it seems like you're trying to push as much stuff as you can, kind of like up the chain into the theme and then to the parent theme, and kind of like in the paragraphs, and like use each step appropriately. So I'm just wondering about like this bottom step of you're writing the component, like where you should be thinking about putting custom logic or specialty one-off stuff that might not be appropriate that you want to share with the whole theme.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, we have put it in the parent themes, like benzi.theme file. And then if there's something really specific to the site, to the child site itself, we put that into the child sites.theme file. But for the most part, we are trying to make the parent theme kind of like the owner. So even if one site needs some special like logic, we try to put it in the parent theme, just because we ran into so many issues over time where we were trying to make things so specific for a child site, but realistically it could or should be available to the entire platform if need be. Yeah.
I think the logic would be in a pre-process.
Yeah.
Like in PHP in a pre-process, not somewhere in the component magically.
Yeah, that's generally how we've done it. Yes?
So I'm sure you've already thought this through, and I just can't think of when I would use a paragraph versus an SDC. Like, why wouldn't I want it just all to be paragraphs?
For us, I think a lot of it was for this like multi-site experience, as well as being able to connect the component library. And I think like a lot of it was that things could be bundled together to be able to just pass values as necessary from the child theme, like the child sites, to the parent, instead of having so much variables between them, you know, because the biggest thing was like being able to reduce costs for bringing sites onto this platform. So that was kind of like the big use case for SDC for us.
So with a paragraph, it's dependent upon the database. If you have multi-site, then you don't have that really. Well,
Yeah.
you don't share paragraphs between multi-sites, I assume.
We do.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
do. We have one configuration that runs all of the sites. But what made me think is, say we have site A that was built in 2018 using a paragraph, and over time maybe that paragraph has changed, and now we have site B, C, and D with their own paragraph, with their own files like this, and maybe a field has been added. Site A never got that field treatment, and so now we have a mishmash of the same paragraph, but now they all send their data to one place, that SDC component, and it's always going to be the SDC component that handles the rendering of that paragraph, so that helps us keep things tidy.
So if it was a paragraph shared, if you change the paragraph on one site, it doesn't change the paragraph on all the sites.
No, it will. However, whatever template we had, and remember I mentioned also sometimes we passed raw values, that may not be accepting a new field. So this is the stuff we were running into like basically 7 years ago. It was just like, oh crap, we forgot that the template we built isn't properly built. We were going to have to update this template, and it's not going to be until a client says, I'm working with site C and I see this new field coming up in the paragraph, but site A is not doing it. What's wrong? And then a ticket's opened, and it's a lot of technical debt.
So I'm just trying to follow. They're not sharing, like if they're using the same component, I guess they're sharing everything. And if you weren't using components, it wouldn't necessarily share everything.
In our setup, not necessarily with how the front end displays the paragraph. Because I mean, you could say, here's a paragraph with 5 fields, but I was feeling mischievous that day and I built a front end template that only shows one of them. You know what I mean? And so there's a lot of flexibility in what you do or don't show.
But if you shared the paragraph would have a shared weight also, right?
Yeah, and except that with our child sites, the child themes, sometimes they would override instead of extend. So we'd basically have different templates and things would get lost in the mix. It wasn't perfect.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So, with the way you're passing in the raw values from the field, the way Drupal does it, does that mean that the props in each of your components are just simply just strings, just waiting for the HTML to render?
For the most part, the props are just waiting for simple strings, and the slots are the ones getting that rendered formatted field markup that Drupal is showing. Sorry if I'm not talking to the microphone. Oh, sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Because you're just sending in the raw rendered Drupalized HTML, does that mean that the components props are just accepting the raw?
And are you distinguishing between props and slots right now?
And I'm not sure what the difference is.
Yeah, okay. So the question was, if we're passing the raw data from Drupal, is the prop or slot just accepting like the raw value, the string? Pretty much, but the slots get the rendered markup of the formatted field, and the properties will usually be getting a very simple like scalar value, a string or a number. So the props generally will be used in attributes. The user probably won't see them. And then the slots are what the user's mostly going to see. And I did want to mention, I forgot to, just for this tag, we do it by hand here, but there is a module. I haven't really used it, but I've seen it, and it gives a UI. It's called SDC Display, and it gives a UI to connect an entity, any entity, with components. So If you want to work in the UI more like a site builder, you can check out that module to basically link up your paragraphs with your site components.
Yes.
You had validation in the YAML file for enumeration, but then you could also do, allowed lists and paragraphs. What's the best practice that you found as far as where to put that stuff, or do you do it in both places?
I think it's fair to say we haven't found the best practice yet, but I was just kind of jazzed to see that, look, all the stuff you can actually do in the component file itself. But you don't need to do it there, but you can.
So you mentioned between rendering the content, that the view as the content instead of passing raw values to the ASCII sequence. And I can see there, for example, the CTA link. One of the issues that we had was like, because we left the rendering part of that variable to be with Drupal, it ended up adding additional HTML structures and other things that would mess up with the structure of the component. So in our use cases, we always ended up passing the raw values and let the SDC control how it wants to render things. And I wonder, like, as you guys mentioned that you rendered this option instead of the other one, if you had any issues that make you choose this option.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, for us, a lot of the styles we already had pre-existing on the sites were using the classes that were coming from Drupal, like that markup. So because we were already doing this was already such a big lift, we wanted to keep using as many of the classes we were already using for styles, rather than pulling in like raw data for these and creating that structure. It just sort of helped with the SAS to CSS transition. Yeah. Yes.
When you were creating the, component list library, does that mean all of the child things have to be in the site's older directory so that, it had access to it?
The question was whether all the child sites have to be in the site's directory to be able to access those themes, and that's a very great question because we have, all our sites are built separately, and we keep our sites in, our site themes in non-standard places, and Drupal doesn't look there to find them. So there's a little add-on I need to work on to be able to find them. But yeah, they would have to be, I think Drupal looks only in a few places for actual themes. You can't just hide a theme inside of a site. We have our themes in the site as opposed to sites all themes, or sorry, that's Drupal 7 instead of themes. Custom and themes. So the short answer, which I wish I would have given from the beginning, is yes. For it to pick it up, it's going to have to be in a standard location for it to find the theme, and the theme will have to be enabled.
And not in the multi-site directory.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you guys ever heard the module Drupal UI patterns? If so, what made you decide to use SDC over that?
I've only come across that module recently, and maybe Alfonso, who is not here, would be better able, he's our technical architect, why we didn't go that route. But it may have just been being a bit naive to it.
Yes.
You mentioned in the component library that it will look for an existing paragraph to display that. What happens if there isn't an existing paragraph?
Then you're stuck filling out those fields yourself. And yeah, and that was the thing, that sometimes it's like paragraphs can have a lot of fields, and it would be just a little pain in the butt if every time you wanted to look at one, you had to put in your dummy data itself. But you do have to if it doesn't have any. All right, I think we're at time. Thank you very much.